Welcome to the Women's Money Wisdom Podcast. I'm Melissa Joy, a certified financial planner and the founder of Pearl Planning. My goal is to help you streamline and organize your finances, navigate big money decisions with confidence, and be strategic in order to grow your wealth. As a woman, you work hard for your money, and I'm here to help you make the most of it. Now, let's get into the show. Did you know that November is National Caregiver Month? For those of you, and I know there are many, who have been a caregiver for family or friends in the past, this probably hits close to home. And for the rest of us, you know that we're only a phone call away from being a caregiver. Today, I have an important guest who's here to shed light on caregiving and the financial considerations, both for those receiving care as well as for the family members responsible for coordinating care. Danielle Miura had her life transformed when at the age of 25, her grandmother fell on a tile floor. She had no formal caregiving training, but she used her financial planning background to help solve complex family financial questions, make decisions, and learn about financial management and estate and legal coordination. Danielle's mission today is to help family caregivers on their journey and to inspire them to take care of their own financial well-being while providing the best care for their families. What more could we ask in terms of a conversation during National Caregiver Month? Danielle, thank you, and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Family caregiving is often a taboo, hidden topic that many people don't discuss. So I really appreciate you having me on here to talk about family caregiving.
It is a taboo topic. It's really difficult to bring it up amongst family members if you're not in that moment where a crisis has presented itself. And I think for a lot of our women listeners, it's probably in that stress thought bubble of what could go wrong. So I just hope that we're reaching the ears of people during their drive time to create space for the courage to have this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I got married young. I was 20, and things were going pretty well for my husband and I. Until 4 years later, I was surprised by a wonderful baby. I was pregnant, and it seemed like our life shifted from being, partners in a marriage to now raising a child, which as only children, we had no formal experience really raising a child. So we're doing everything very trial and error based. Because we really had, at the most I did was babysitting and changing a diaper. And that was pretty much it. So we pretty much learned everything from scratch. We knew at some time that family caregiving would pose to be something that we may have in our future. As both only children, we suspected that our parents would need help in the future. But did I know that I would somehow need to care for my grandmother at 25? That wasn't something that posed a question in my brain. So it was kind of like a shock to me. At that time, we were finally feeling financially stable. We were saving half of our income. We were really incomfortably saving. It wasn't like it wasn't like a burden to save that much, but it was just we felt comfortable doing so. It was our financial plan, our family planning guide. And then it's caregiving hit, and it was there was just a lot of obstacles. And I feel like as women, we experience, whether we want to or not, we experience a lot of obstacles within our financial planning that often don't get talked about.
So true. And, what does caregiving mean? Some of it could be the actual delivery of medical or personal care, but then it's also the work of the business of care as well, in terms of managing and navigating, paperwork and schedules and things like that. To the extent that you're comfortable sharing, what did it look like for you?
Yeah, so I consider myself part of a care team. My mom and I mostly cared for my grandmother. My mom was the power of attorney for her at the time. My duties were to take her to doctor's appointments, pick up medications. We delivered food, homemade meals to her. And sometimes just caregiving means just sitting down with your loved one or your care recipient and just being there emotionally. I think we often forget the emotional impact we can make on our aging loved ones.
So incredible when you have that capability and also are willing to share it. And I would imagine it would also come with a cost in terms of your time, your financial, your human capital, your ability to earn, your financial well-being, and your emotional, physical well-being. What do you find with caregivers that, what areas get touched?
Yeah, so for me, just sharing my personal perspective, unfortunately, due to the care needs that my grandmother needed, I wasn't able to, holding a full-time job was very difficult. And so some could say that I was a forced entrepreneur and that I needed flexibility in order to take care of her. Due to limited time capacity, there was only so many clients that I could take on. Therefore, I didn't have as much income as I would have liked. And that it seems like dipping into our savings was kind of that 50% that we saved. The savings that we had, we dipped into. And I don't regret that experience. I'm really grateful for the time that I had with my grandmother. But for a lot of people, there's a lot of financial impact involved in family caregiving.
What was the length of time that the caregiving continued for you and your mom with your grandmother?
Yeah, so it was 3 years total. And it's interesting that 3 years was kind of my limit of this is as much as I can do. And that was it. And she read that pretty close to the line of 3 years. So in a way, it was good timing. But it's never death is never good timing, unfortunately.
So true.
But for just if I were to say like general statistics, a third of caregivers dip into their savings. Many caregivers feel like they missed promotions, taking time out of work, whether that's to caregive, whether that's shifting from full-time to part-time work. Early retirement is common. So there's a lot of financial impact involved in family caregiving. I'm actually doing a social media campaign for the month of November where friends of mine, as well as colleagues, have shared in video submissions, shared their experiences about the financial impact of caregiving, because it's often for many people to just hide behind doors and have those conversations within themselves and bottle up that financial stress within themselves. And because of that, I was hoping that by spreading awareness and sharing these videos about the financial impact of caregiving, that many family caregivers would reach out to resources to help them.
Oh, we're going to get into some of those resources as this episode unfolds. But where can people find your wonderful, I love this, your National Caregiver Month campaign?
Yeah, so it'll be on 3 different social media sites, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram.
Lovely.
I believe I shared my social media pages. So
perfect. We'll have a link to resources. Yes, we'll be happy to link that. And I think one of the really important considerations and factors is no one has a magic wand. And sometimes people, when they consider reaching out to professionals, think, well, I need to wait till I figure out this situation and then have my money act together, if using a financial planner as an example, when sometimes there's opportunities missed if you don't access and seek resources sooner, not later. What are some of the lessons you've learned, and what are some of your go-to resources for people listening and nodding, saying, this is me right now?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a lot of financial education related resources for family caregivers. You would think that approximately 40% of the American population, that there would be more resources. But unfortunately, there's really not much. I recently did kind of an estimate of how many blogs and articles are out there related to family caregiving and money. and it's like less than 190 articles, and 65
Wow.
of them are mine.
Well, we're glad to add to the very limited volume of content that's around this, but I'm so glad that you're doing this, because what we hear is it's repeated back as a statistic, especially for women, that one of the reasons that you are at risk later in later years is because many women take time out of their career for caregiving as well as child rearing. And thus, because women are also more likely to live longer, they kind of have a double whammy where they've saved less. Their Social Security earnings record is less strong on average than men's, and they're going to be living longer, so they need resources that will last longer. And so what better way to combat that than to go, as you're doing, right to the source of those years where you're making those caregiving decisions?
Yeah, it's hard because I feel like as women, usually we're more emotionally inclined than males to make emotional decisions. And we really care really strongly for people, and we really want the best for people. But sometimes that can be a two-edged sword when it comes to family caregiving.
Beyond the financial resources, are there other resources? Is there a broader, broader volumes of information about the emotional and social toll on caregiving, and better resources on the mental health side of things?
Yeah, there's actually a plethora of really great resources about self-care and how to prioritize yourself. I can give you a blog of a bunch of different resources, and people can view those and select what interests them or pertains to their situation. The complexity about family caregiving is that there's so many different types of caregiving situations. It's not just for the aging loved one anymore. It's long distance caregivers. It's dementia caregivers. It's special needs caregivers, caring for an aging adult child, not an aging, but an adult child.
Yeah.
So we're just kind of expanding the definition of what family caregiving looks like.
So true. And it can impact because over time, people have, especially with the digital communication, we can be in a different part of the country, trying to, worrying about and caring for family. Sometimes people make decisions about relocation. They make decisions about major changes to their life based on their family's needs. And sometimes they also don't. And so, it is such a complex and fraught with emotion and pain. And also there isn't a textbook that can say, this is how you're going to do it, right?
Yeah, every situation is different. I'd love to say that I have a handbook that answers every single question that you're going to have. I was thinking today about like my daughter asking me about death and that conversation. I didn't have anything in my toolbox that said, this is how you're supposed to talk about death. This is how you're supposed to be grieving, on top of having a conversation with your young one about death, death of a loved one that you cared for so much.
It's so true. And in those moments, there's a limited capacity for time to really say, oh, this is something I'd like to put in the parking lot and tackle. You've just got to kind of have that discussion in the car and hope you did as best you could, right? So
yeah, that's the best you can. Sometimes just being average, doing the best you can is the best you can.
For people who struggle with seeking more resources, are there certain kind of lessons that you learned that you think are tips that you have for caregivers that you think it's important for us to discuss and share today?
Yeah. So from the self-care side or the financial side, or maybe a mix of both?
Let's start on self-care, because I think in any financial discussion, your well-being is a great place to start. It lays the framework for everything else going well. And then let's talk financial.
Yeah. So for the self-care side, I would talk about creating a self-care routine. Many people think that self-care is just a thing you were born with and you just automatically have this routine that you just develop over time. I really think that self-care and placing boundaries is a learned skill people develop. It's not
that's
something
so
that's
true.
genetically there for you.
Can you relate what some self-care routines are that you either recommend to people or might have been beneficial for you?
Yeah, so I think everybody's self-care journey is a little bit different. So I don't want to impose that like you should be doing X, Y, and Z. I didn't really learn as much about, I'm a workaholic. And then on top of being a family caregiver,
Yes.
it was just like a double whammy on both sides. And then having a younger child and balancing that all was just a really hard combination for me. And so I got to the point where I was just so burnt out, I had no other choice but to seek help. And in that, I got a therapist and we started working on some of these self-care routines that I should have developed before I started caregiving, but it took me to burnout to realize that I really need to prioritize and focus on myself. And so through that, I told the therapist, like, I don't want someone to like mope and dope me. I don't want someone that's like just going to tell me like, poor you, like this is a hard life for you. I want someone to give me tools in my toolbox so I can be successful. So we started experimenting with a bunch of different self-care routines. Some of the things that I did was I had a journal, specifically a grief journal at that time, that I would just sit in my car. And so I would arrive to my daughter's school like 5 minutes or 10 minutes early and just sit in the parking lot, which usually the parking lot was full. So you don't want to get there like a minute before or you're not going to have a parking space anyway. So it worked in my favor. I would just take out that book and I would just write down my thoughts for that day. And that was even though it was a small thing, that was my 5 or 10 minutes just for me to sit on my grief at that time.
I think that's beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, so some of the small things can build up to being really great things. I would sit on the grass with my daughter and just look at the sky. And if she just ran around the park, it was a very secluded area. So it's like I watched her and then watched, like it was time to relax and time for her to play with other kids. So she was getting her self-care in, but it was also time for me to just relax and take a breather and meditate. I used to do a lot of grounding. So using your 5 senses, you think about what is you're experiencing right now. So right now I'm hearing you, Melissa. I'm smelling the wood that's in my room. I'm touching my desk. And so using your 5 senses, you can think it's like a meditation tool to really get your center of focus. So as I said, everybody's different in how they do self-care. I just find that especially for family caregivers, some of the simplest things are the best things. I utilized libraries. They have great events sometimes. And so I would just take my daughter to the events. She would like put crafts together or they would have a read aloud book. And that was my time to process and be me. Maximizing what you have available to you. What's in your community? Where can you get little hints of your feeling of yourself back? Whether that's blaring music in the car because you're finally driving alone or, you want to get back to where you are, who you are, because often that is separated in so many different roles.
I love that description of keeping a connection with your identity and who you are in a state of, contentment, which can be so difficult when things out of your control are, in your life. Talk to me a little bit about some suggestions you have on the financial side of things. You're a financial planner, so this is what you do day to day, often working with caregivers, which is so extraordinary.
Thank you. Yeah, the question I hear most, especially from sandwich generation caregivers, so those for me, like me, that are caring for an aging adult and caring for a child, a lot of the complexity of planning that we get into is understanding how to balance savings between the three different generations. Many people are paying for costs for their loved ones because long-term care is super expensive. And so
So
you may be
expensive.
paying for long-term care for your loved one and then balancing yourself. How do you protect yourself and care for yourself during that time? Because your finances may be very limited. And then as a child, you may be smashed because financially because you're paying for childcare
Right.
or you're paying for their extracurricular activities after school. Things really add up when you have a child. I was so lucky that she was the first half year we didn't put her into daycare. And so she was home for most of that time. And then once in California, they have transitional kindergarten. So she went to school starting at 4. And so that was a great, transition for me. I actually wrote a letter to the teacher saying, thank you so much for having this available because I couldn't do caregiving without you. I was so burnt out. I was so grateful to have the school available. Going in and out of the hospitals because my grandmother had health issues was not possible with having a child at home.
Well, and for that sandwich generation, when we just talked about you need to, in some cases, reduce work, take breaks from work. And so, but then when you're not working, it's not like you have the ability to have undivided attention for kids. So you have less earnings to pay for the childcare that you still need, because even though your time is reduced in the workplace, it's going toward assistance in often circumstances that are not child friendly.
Yeah, and that's the hard part in finding those balance between things. But also, if there's no balance, there's no possibility of balance able to occur, which sometimes there is. If you're paying for childcare and then you're paying for long-term care, your self-care budget may not exist. And unfortunately, that's sometimes the reality of certain circumstances. I can't tell a client, oh, you shouldn't be paying for childcare or
Right.
you shouldn't be paying for your long-term care. That would be extremely judgmental of me and not right of me to tell them this is wrong for you for caring for the people that you love. But instead, I can do things and suggest things like a solution fund. So a solution fund is something people can contribute into a fund to whenever you need a solution, like you need self-care or you unfortunately don't have enough money to come up with childcare or long-term care that month, you can use funds within that account and have people contribute to it. There may be people in your life that are like, I just want to support you. I want to help you. But in those times, most of the time, you don't have a list of like to-dos of people that can help you. I really suggest a written like list or a phone list on your phone in your notes of ways people can help you, because people will ask. And you'll be like, I have no clue.
So is that something you help for your caregiving clients? You help to develop the solution fund and also, hey, this would be reasonable to, like let's use an example where there's a family member that's local who's kind of volunteered to be the boots on the ground, but then there are family members that are further away or aren't having to diminish their own work because of the work that caregiver is doing. So have you counseled people on what would be reasonable and ways to kind of broach that?
Yeah, and how to start those conversations. I think the conversation part is the hardest thing. Like
Sure.
for me, for example, even though I know my grandmother owed me money for gas for taking her to doctor's appointments, and I'm a financial planner, so I should have these conversations just like perfectly mapped out. I felt uncomfortable asking for gas money. I felt uncomfortable asking for maintenance money for my car because I was unsure of what she would say, even though I knew she had the money. And 2, it was just very like uncomfortable. Sometimes you just rather pay it out of your pocket so that you don't have to have those uncomfortable conversations. And that's why I think creating the solution fund, which is one idea, can really pose less uncomfortable conversations. You could say, will you get me a gift card to go out to dinner? Or I would like to get a massage or get my nails done for this month. Can you give me a gift card for that? So it doesn't feel like it's as much of a monetary solution, but it's something someone can give to support a family caregiver.
I love that. And you've introduced me to the concept of a solution fund. I'm sure I will be using it in the near future in conversations with clients. Any other financial considerations, and also, just things you'd wish you'd had the opportunity to discuss before you were in the caregiving circumstance that you encourage people to consider and have those difficult conversations earlier?
So as I say, get your finances in order, get your loved ones' finances in order. Usually that's the quickest, easiest answer. Many people don't know what their finances are. They've never had a road map of what their finances are. So they don't even know what they're getting themselves into financially when they start family caregiving. And that's really sad, because if you know at least what your financial circumstances are, you can map out what your limitations are. So for me, I knew 3 years was my max, and that's all I could do. That was my financial boundary that I put in place. And many people are like, I'll just do this for 10 years because there's no limit. And that can happen where you're a dementia caregiver and the length of caregiving is 10 years. But imagine 10 years without being in the workforce. Imagine 10 years of focusing so much on one person, which is amazing. I really am grateful for your work and admire it. But when you've given so much time to one person, it's so hard to focus on yourself and what your needs are. It's like you're almost like waiting till you're in your 50s or sometimes 60s to grapple these topics. And at that time, if you're trying to get back into the workforce at those ages, you're dealing with ageism at that point. Unfortunately, ageism does exist. That's why I mention it. So you may have a really hard time getting back into the workforce. You may have to choose jobs that you are well qualified for, but are not paying at the rate that should make you whole.
You were used to. Yeah. Oh, that's a lot to think about. When you've had circumstances where you were advising people where they didn't know where the boundary was themselves, have you been able to intentionally advise them to have a boundary that served them, but also, was as much as was possible considering the needs of the person receiving care?
I think it's more of giving yourself grace and knowing that I have a year to give, or I'm willing to go part-time for the time being. Work to me, like maybe say hypothetically, work to this person is their self-care. They love working. It makes them whole, the social aspect of work, because there's a lot of positive things about being in the workplace. Unfortunately, there's a lot of negatives as well, but for some people, there's a lot of there's a lot of positive things with being in the workplace. And when you're quitting your job to be a family caregiver, you're diminishing those positive things, or you're finding things to replace those positive things, which is often hard because you feel so isolated at that time. So if you can make limitations for yourself and say, I'm willing to do family caregiving, but I'm only able to do it at this certain capacity, whether that's doing part-time caregiving, or I'm only able to take my loved one to doctor's appointments 3 times a week instead of 5. And someone else has got to do the other aspects of that. Or I'm going to have my loved one go to adult daycare during the day, and then after that, I'll take care of them during the nighttime shift, and hoping that they sleep through the night so I'm not woken up several times during the night.
I'm thinking of a conversation that I had recently with a client, and it had to do with the needs of a family member that was very long distance, and there was another family member that was kind of autocratically saying, like, calling the shots of like, here's who will be going to call on and, go to manage the situation, which involved a lot of travel. And so I think the advisor in that circumstance, the decision had already been made in this round, but it was like, hey, we need to have a discussion about what is kosher in terms of like, you can't, it's not an appropriate boundary to be told at the drop of a hat, you need to get on a flight, unless that's what you want. But, like having it come up repeated times resulted in the need to have a discussion about what the boundaries are, and you get to determine your contribution to it, and we should seek an opportunity to insert something that would be, kind of a backstop in the moments that you can't be the one to do that.
Yeah, and that's why I love caregiver agreements / contracts. Is just like any job description, you're describing exactly what your caregiver duties. You're setting the limitations for yourself. I'm willing to take my loved one to the doctor's appointments. I'm willing to fly halfway across the country 2 times a year. That's my expectation of what my job entails. And for that job, this is what I will receive. Whether that's an inheritance or whether that's an hourly or salary pay, this will help compensate me for my trip. It will help compensate me for the time that I'm taking to care for you. Now, not everybody is able to utilize that due to limited finances of their care recipient. But
of course,
I love that there's limitations and drawing that line of what you're expected to do.
I feel like we could talk all day about this, but given the limitations of time, I'm curious, based on your experiences, what your thoughts are and how you advise people who are younger, who are not the ones receiving care, about how to think about long-term care and long-term care insurance based on your experiences. Just tell us, where you sit based on what you've learned.
Yeah, so I'm grateful to have seen 2 sides of the coin. My grandmother had long-term care insurance, which she bought, I think, in the 90s. Like, okay, it's really like a really old insurance policy.
I had a job in the 90s when I was in college. I was an administrator at a long-term care, like a regional long-term care insurance office. So I was seeing people like your grandmother back in the day. The insurance was very different than it is today, in terms of what you could get and receive. But I'm glad to hear she was able to use that.
Yeah. And so, like, I was grateful that her policy was actually decently manageable, but it didn't cover her whole care. It only covered 75% of her in-home care. So she was still she still had to take out about $6,000 of long-term care expenses a month, which for some people
from elsewhere,
someone's salaries is $6,000 a month
or more than after tax. Yeah. So she had long-term care insurance, and what's the other side of the coin?
The other side of the coin is her sister didn't have long-term care insurance, but she decided to pay everything forthright.
How did that work?
Interesting. I don't have any research data or anything to prove these concepts I have. This is just my own perspective.
Yeah, anecdotal.
But I found that the sister who didn't have long-term care insurance put more effort in getting herself healthy.
Interesting.
And I don't know if that's due to, obviously there's a lot of limitations and other perspectives on this. That could be to her will to live, maybe more will to live, or maybe more stubbornness, but they're both stubborn. But I'm wondering if it had to do with, I know that I'm going to have to fork out $15,000 next month. I'm going to make sure that I'm feeling better so that I don't have to pay this next month.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, to me, long-term care is so new. Insurance is so nuanced. It's ever evolving, and it is very expensive. So if you haven't looked at those types of policies, they're not cheap at all. They've kind of evolved so that there's other types of kind of hybrid life insurance in some cases, but it is not something where it's just like life insurance or disability insurance where it's like, you need this check, go get it, if you can qualify. It's a very nuanced area, just like you're describing.
Yeah, I like the comfortability and the security of having something in place like an insurance policy. You're not like we are right now trying to pull out money from a bunch of different accounts to pay for long-term care because it's super expensive. So I like something in place. But as you said, the insurance policies weren't like they were in the 90s.
No.
And they're super complex and can be very expensive. So really determining, plan for long-term care as early as possible. Determine your wishes because they'll evolve over time. And usually they'll evolve over time based off of your own caregiving experiences. So like for me, I know that I like more of a communal setting where my husband is like, just put me wherever you want. At that point, I won't really care. So just find the cheapest location, one that's close to you, and go through less hassle as possible. So that maybe 10 years down the road, maybe my husband will change that perspective and he'll want to be with me in the same community that I'm in. So everybody re-evaluating your goals and your perspectives each year really make a difference. And then planning as early as possible. I'm not expecting a 20-year-old to have a financial plan in place for long-term care, but I will expect that they have some type of perspective on long-term care, some type of wishes in place, so that if it does happen to them, that they at least have wishes, and then hopes that they're planning for the impact on disability.
Yes, absolutely. It's so important to, these are examples of things that nobody likes to talk about. The same goes with, we could have another 45-minute conversation just about estate planning considerations and making sure that you have the right documents and name the right people and they know that they're named, if you are incapacitated, for death or disability. And so there's so much to consider. And I very much feel like it's a personal decision when it comes to long-term care insurance. I do think there's a mismatch because many people I talk to in their 60s are very concerned about it, but it's also often more difficult to become insured then. I got my own insurance early 40s, and that's just not a time where people want to write, big checks to policies about how, you're going to receive skilled care in your hopefully 80s or 90s. And so I think listening to conversations like this are extremely valuable. And having frank discussions like you're describing with your spouse, right? Like about what matters to you. And, unfortunately you guys have visited those conversations probably because of your own experiences, but that's often the case.
Yeah. And I think that it's made it easier to have those conversations because I'll be like I'll be in the car with my parents and we've just visited our care recipient. And I'll be like, well, if you had to make this decision, what would you want me to make? What decision would you want me to make in this circumstance? Would you want me to put you in hospice? Would you want me to put you in a nursing home rather than assisted living community? So it kind of opens, unfortunately, this experience, even though it's a hard experience, can open up the conversation to other people for having these conversations.
Well, I hope that everyone listening follows Danielle. We will include links to your social media and resources. Danielle, is there anything you want to leave us with as we're kind of concluding?
Yeah, I think the major thing is you're not alone as a family caregiver. Many people are hidden behind the shadows in being a family caregiver. And it's so important, even though you may be isolated and alone, that you seek the help that you need and you deserve, because no one has to do it alone.
I think that's a beautiful message. I hope that someone listening today needs to hear that message. And Danielle, as you can hear in these conversations, is a financial planner who's devoted to this area. We really met, across LinkedIn and Twitter, and your authenticity and sincerity on this topic really, you can hear it in the things that you share. And so for anyone who feels like they're sitting in this boat and they need those boundaries, they need the solution account, I would encourage you to reach out to Danielle. Danielle, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Women's Money Wisdom Podcast. If you found value in this episode, the best way you can support the podcast is to forward an episode to a friend or leave a review. Go to pearlplan.com and the podcast link to get all the resources and links mentioned.